Good evening, everybody. I am Nick, Pennsylvania. I am here with Brendan, aka Bond, and it's going to be a little different. Those of you who listened to our most recent episode, the update, the very brief thing where I spoke at length for a good 10 minutes, I don't know. I mentioned that we were going to have some other people while Mike is out, and this evening we are here with my friend Brian, who some of you, if you listened a few episodes back, may recall Brian shared a story with us about a strange encounter, a possible Thunderbird encounter, a very interesting story nonetheless about a abnormally large bird sighting that he had experienced some years back. So welcome aboard, Brian.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here,
Thank you,
Brian.
Nick. Thank you, Brendan.
I'm going to start by throwing you under the bus a little bit, Brendan, putting you on the spot here. Now,
Cool.
We had actually recorded a full episode that has not come out yet because Mike typically edits these. And again, Mike is very busy with some family stuff right now.
Mm-hmm.
But a very strange thing happened, and I'm going to kind of recap because that hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
As we were recording, and it was captured on Brendan's microphone, there was a large explosion in the immediate vicinity of his house. Now, this has happened several times before, and seemingly there's no good explanation. As I recall, it occurred around the 10:30 time in the middle of the night. Brendan, can you kind of talk about that a little bit? And I am especially curious. We've already kind of discussed what could this possibly be about, but I am especially curious to hear Brian's input on this because these sort of mysterious sounds have been documented in other places in the world. And I think, Brian, you had actually brought to my attention a phenomenon that was happening in the Pacific Northwest, if I recall, about strange noises in the environment. Brendan, can you kind of recap what happened that night and also tell us how you've experienced this several times in the past?
Yeah, so there's kind of two sides to this ongoing story. One is that we've had, in where I'm at in southwestern Butler County, over the past, I'd say, year and a half, there have been on maybe 4 or 5 occasions now a very large boom or bang that sounds like it's coming from outside the house, but there does not seem to be any, destruction or anything. Like, it's not like a car blowing up or something like that. On some occasions, other people have heard it. Other times, it's literally just been like me and like whatever animal happens to be near. Now, the one that happened just when we were recording a few weeks ago was so loud that it shook the windows here, and you could hear it on the microphone, which in that episode, I believe I pulled that audio out and gave it to Mike. But again, my parents who were downstairs at the house didn't hear anything, which is just kind of odd. The times that it's happened before, it has sounded almost like either anything from like almost like a car falling on the top of the house. Like, it gets loud, like it shakes the house. Other times it's definitely outside, but it's loud enough that it really kind of like rattles the whole house. And whenever you kind of go outside to check, there's no, like, it's not like my neighbor just, set off a big bonfire with gasoline or something like that. Like, you don't smell any chemicals in the air or anything. Some of the things we've talked about as possible explanations for it have been gas well, like blow off explosions, like air explosions, because there are a number of fracking sites within a few miles of here. The other has been that people are just setting off like quarter sticks or tannerite or something like that, because there is quite a bit of open land around here where, someone could in theory be doing that safely, but it certainly is jarring.
Well, and it's a weird hour of the night for it to happen.
Yeah, and
it'd be weird that it would be a singular, because say if you were using quarter sticks to blow tree stumps out or setting off mortars, which, this being around the 4th of July, you would expect to hear more than a singular.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of people setting off fireworks over this last weekend, as is tradition, and these don't sound like that. Like that's one thing I remember noting is that it has sounded very different.
One final thing I want to add: did you not tell me once that you kind of feel some tension right before this happens?
So what is
Almost like with your body, when you're getting a Charlie horse moments before you actually get one.
Yeah, so it hasn't so much been physical, but what has happened, and this is kind of like where things take the weird turn. All of these have been precipitated by very intense experiences of deja vu for me that aren't necessarily like negative or anything, but there's definitely something weird that happens within like a day or so previous to these things happening. And the only reason I correlate those is because the first two times this happened were relatively close. The issues, the experiences of deja vu that I had were weird enough that it was still on the top of my mind, when these things happened. Not saying they're like traumatic or anything, but they're enough that it was on the top of my mind.
So, like I said, you and I have already discussed this at length. That episode will eventually come out. But Brian, hearing Brendan's story, and again, I know you and I have talked about different audio experiences. I'm really curious about what your initial thoughts are.
Yeah, as I was listening to Brendan describe the phenomena, I got thinking a little bit about some of the paranormal aspects of Bigfoot and infrasound. I don't know if either of you have addressed that issue on this podcast, but infrasound seems to be one of the new dynamics that is prevalent in Bigfoot research, where there's these very low audible sounds that can only be heard at certain frequencies, but yet it causes a physiological response. And in some people, it can cause headaches, extreme abnormal central nervous system impacts. You've also, I know there's documentaries like Skinwalker Ranch and those places where there's also thought that there is some kind of invisible impact, or there's a inaudible sound that's impacting people's neurological functioning, and the researchers are there. So I mean, you can go from the very logical, and it sounds extremely logical, of a fracking type issue, or maybe there's a geomagnetic issue of some kind that we don't know about that would be occurring in the natural world. But I really wonder if there's some other kind of explanation from a paranormal standpoint of an infrasound.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. When it comes to infrasound in the paranormal, how it's talked about in the paranormal community at large, you do hear a lot of it in Bigfoot accounts, where in my opinion, I think it's used a lot as a catch-all. Whenever you kind of can't explain something, it's kind of like, oh well, it might be an effective infrasound, because we know that infrasound is absolutely a scientific documentable thing, but just like electromagnetic fields, like you were saying, Brian, they tend to affect people in very different and strange ways that we're not used to interacting with, or documenting. So how it's produced and where it comes from is kind of anomalous, and then how it affects people is also anomalous, but I think there's definitely something to that. And when you talk about like the geomagnetic structure and everything, especially with fracking, that's a really interesting thing, because you do hear people talking in all elements of high strangeness and folklore and everything about how you have different areas have just different vibrational levels or magnetic levels, or have different feels to them, and a lot of that can be traced to magnetic anomalies, geologic structures as a result.
Yeah, I want to jump in too, because one of the things with this infrasound thing, it makes me wonder. One, we've talked about this briefly, not with relation to Bigfoot, but I'm glad you mentioned that, Brian, because I want to go there in a minute. But we've spoken about, there was a much publicized example of, I believe it was a government building in which the HVAC system was creating an infrasound, and it was causing people to have hallucinations, as auditory and both visual. Well-documented example.
Yeah.
So I know we've touched base on that, but here's something else. I do know too, or at least it's my understanding, that this can occur in the ground as well. And with as much fracking as what's occurring in your immediate region, it makes me wonder if you're not getting these sensations because there is that going on, and maybe this explosion that you're hearing is the result of that buildup.
Absolutely.
That's me reaching a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're trying to explain, obviously, we're trying to explain something that's kind of weird by things that are also kind of weird. But going back to the whole Earth thing, like Brian was saying, you could have these vibrations that are so low in frequency that they're inaudible. You wouldn't be hearing them, but they could be having effects on your physical or mental state. And that very well could be a very, kind of quote unquote hard science explanation for me having those weird feelings ahead of time, and then there being a physical reaction in nature around me. That doesn't mean I'm like there's any precognition on my part. It's me picking up on something that is just, inherently there. Nick, with some of your family members that work in geology, have you heard of anything else like this as far as like earth sounds or anything?
I've heard of seismologists talking about how prior to, the buildup of pressure and the slow moving can create frequencies. And some people, I think this might be more hypothetical, not hypothetical, but like a hypothesis that these are the frequencies that some people claim that animals start responding immediately prior to earthquakes. And there's documents
or tsunamis or
and whether or not they're responding to those frequencies. So that's an interesting thing. And maybe that's something like the example Brian brings up. Maybe that's something you're responding to. But let's go back to the Bigfoot thing real quick. Brian, speak a little more about the infrasound connection, because that is not something I've heard in relation to the Bigfoot lore.
Yeah, sure. I think, what you have, and I've been doing quite a bit more inquiry into Bigfoot as more of a paranormal or maybe even an alien phenomena. Quite a bit of popularity these days with the shows on TV. There's quite a bit of research going on. But interestingly, there is a lot more legitimate research going on trying to measure certain types of physical characteristics related to Bigfoot sounds, related to recording frequencies, recording different kinds of phenomena like cloaking, where they can make there's an invisibleness. It's just an absolutely fascinating, and cloaking and making solid objects invisible is a physical proven fact. The physicists have proven ways to create invisibility. So there's a lot of physiological or even physics-related concepts related to these phenomena. Recording them seems to be beyond just getting a plaster of a foot or something physical in that fashion. The research seems to be going more towards recording and establishing baselines around certain kinds of physiological phenomena, including using infrared to record shapes and figures, but yet comparing that against, can I physically see that in reality? And some of the latest things that I have seen is more of a recording around different frequencies, sounds, matching those up against other databases and sampling, recording how people feel, what they sense when they're in the presence of some type of a Bigfoot anomaly. I'll call it anomaly because I think there's a lot of discussion and disagreement about what that is and it isn't. And there's also a lot of discussions around orbs and things that occur when there's a Bigfoot present, and how they cannot seem to get a concrete picture of that being. So sound is a big part of it, and I have not dug into it certainly as much, but they're starting to use very hard scientific measuring devices to elicit sound and then record it and then compare it on a computer screen. And there's certainly people that have reported that they feel very sick or they're feeling a sense of dizziness or an ill effect when in the presence of some kind of an anomaly.
So it's like a smoke and fire relationship, it sounds like, where you feel like this deja vu episode, as Brendan described, is just one very weird state that we occasionally find ourselves in, but it seems to be related. And so too, as you mentioned, orbs and whatnot with Bigfoot.
Yeah, certainly there seems to be more of a focus on using hard science in order to record these phenomena. And sound is a significant part of it. eDNA, collecting dirt samples in known or supposed places, looking at certain tree structure patterns. But just the anomaly of looking, I know I saw recently a documentary, which was just absolutely fascinating, where it was a legitimate research group who went in and used some very high power sound as well as visual heat sensing equipment, and they were able to. It was obvious they were able to pick up. And they were in, I think, the Olympia National Forest up in Washington, which is kind of a very key area for a lot of this stuff. And they could see an 8-9 foot structure based upon the measurements and things. They could see this on infrared, but when they flashed a flashlight, which was just across from the creek bed, there was nothing there. But yet they could hear sound, they could feel vibrations. There was all kinds of things that they could sense physically, but they could not see.
I have so much to add to that. You bring up a lot of really, really interesting points, Brian. And I think one of the important things is, like you're saying, there's this big push right now to use science to explain these anomalies. You're right. I mean, sound is a huge part of almost every phenomena that we look at, including Bigfoot. And we were talking about analyzing. The first thing I thought of was whenever people first analyzed the Sierra sounds, which for those who aren't familiar, were caught, I believe, in the Sierra Nevada mountains back in, I believe, the 70s. It was on like reel-to-reel tape initially.
I think you're correct, Brendan. Yeah, it was the 1970s.
Yeah.
Well, and then up in the Pacific Northwest, I think in British Columbia, there was that town that was getting those haunting, it sounded like metal being like a piece of metal, because I know, Brian, that you and I had spoken about that a couple of years back. And I believe that had been explained, but I wasn't exactly sure. But go on, Brendan.
Yeah, and there are a few other just specific. We could do a whole episode just on anomalous sounds. Like is it the Hudson hum? There's some city up in the Hudson Valley that like everyone just hears a hum for some reason, and they can't figure out where it's coming from. No, with the Sierra sounds, like you have something that's captured on technology, has been deemed by experts to be, legitimate in the sense that like the original tapes weren't tampered with or doctored in any way. And you have linguistic scholars saying, hey, we don't know what this is, but it is some form of language. That's really interesting. And that's definitely like a hard science kind of approach. But at the same time, in the Sierra, whenever they're capturing the Sierra sounds, Ron Moorhead and the rest of those people also saw, like you said, Brian, anomalous lights. These anomalies seem to cover the spectrum of auditory, visual, multiple types of visuals. I don't know if we want to get this weird right off this early, but I know Josh Cutchin wrote a book called Brimstone Deceit that was all specifically just about the smells associated with the paranormal. So, I mean, it really does kind of cover the gambit. And I think that's why whenever we do have issues like this that we're trying to, conjecture about, it's important to think of all the different elements that you can measure these things by. Again, especially when you're trying to use hard science to try and figure out what a lot of these things are, because like you said, Brian, with like footprints and video evidence and all these kind of things, especially if we're talking about like cryptids specifically, not even worrying about the eyewitness testimony, there's tons of actual physical evidence. But the problem we keep running into is like, is it ever going to be enough? That's the kind of issue I kind of run into a lot. But I like what you were saying about I'd like to see that documentary we're talking about. Was that the Olympia project? by chance?
No, that was Expedition Bigfoot. It was on the
Okay.
Travel Channel.
Okay, cool.
It's on Discovery Plus. You could probably stream it, and it was their second season. And this is a
Okay.
group made up of a world-renowned primatologist who has actually discovered species. So she's a very legitimate individual.
Hard science, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she's a scientist who's very skeptical, boohoos everything that comes around, and but has a primate knowledge. The other person is an ex-Marine, kind of I think he's like a ranger. He's like a guy who's like a survivalist, who's not really afraid of anything, but knows how to track things very well. The other person is an expedition. He's like in charge of operations. So he kind of sits back and takes care of all the technological. And then there's a guy who's just kind of like a random Bigfoot researcher who's kind of open-minded. And they were in the Olympia National Forest. There's like a 2-part series. They were in Appalachia and Kentucky. And what they've done is they've developed some kind of algorithm that they take it's like a bunch of scatter plots, I think, of the entire country, and they know where the movements are. And so they have like a window of about 21 days along a certain area. They were literally across a creek bed. They had tracked something there. And it was it was the most fascinating episode I've ever seen, where they were probably no more than 20 feet away from this very large bush, and they caught this 8 to 9 foot something on, infrared. But then they took a very high beaming flashlight across the creek, and there was nothing there.
Yeah.
And they were able to research this through talking to world-renowned physicists and others who said, you can actually create a cloaking effect if you're able to bend light waves in a certain way. And interestingly, as they found this, and I don't think that this was actually, concocted. I think it was just spontaneous. The military the U.S. military has some bases very close to the Olympia National Forest. And just as this being was found on their infrared, there were helicopters going over them. And it was just very
That's
odd,
a coincidence,
very unusual. And so there is a theory and I know I'm kind of going far afield here with this, but there's a theory that the military knows about some of these physical properties of these entities, if you want to call them that, or alien creatures or Bigfoot cryptids, and they're researching them themselves or are very aware. But I'll have to get that link to you or something.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's really interesting to me is, we live in this age of just the rate at which technology has exploded has been incredible, an unprecedented thing. I mean, we can look at the industrial age and we can see just how much it doubles over the advancements we make. And I think our mythology is beginning to reflect that as well, because the whole alien mythology has always represented this superior level of intelligence, superior level of technology. Ghosts have represented, to me, is the way I see it, eternity, this timelessness, this undying aspect. And Bigfoot and their ilk have always represented natural man, primeval man. It seems as though there has been a shift, and I wonder how much our technological advancements mean that we have to view our mythology changes in a way, because it hasn't been up until recent years. I would say maybe the last 15, probably the last 20 years, because I'm probably slow in learning about it, where I start hearing about these cryptids, Bigfoot in particular, and I believe so because it's a hominid, but Bigfoot in particular, there's conversation about interdimensional travel and this alien connection. Where do you two think that comes from recently? How has that developed?
So I'll take the first crack at that. So I think historically you have, I know we've cited it before on this show, but Stan Gordon's silent invasion after the Kecksburg incident. He was the first one to kind of say, like, hey, Not saying UFOs and Bigfoot are the same thing, but boy, do we see a lot of UFOs around Bigfoot sightings and vice versa. I think you had for a long time the big, this is again speaking in generalizations, but I think for a long time you had the Bigfoot community thinking that UFO folks were crazy and UFO folks thought the Bigfoot folks were all crazy. No one was sharing data, no one was sharing stories. And then I'm not sure what the kind of like nexus event would be, but over time you have people starting to share stories again. I feel like in the 90s and 2000s, and I think part of it has to deal with movies getting a little more, and fiction getting a little more creative with this whole kind of Big Ten hypothesis that all these anomalies are all the same thing and they're all not the same thing at the same time. Because I know, like what we said before, is that, you know, if you see a light in a house, it's a ghost. If you see a light in the woods, it is a will-o'-the-wisp. You see a light in the sky, it's a UFO. But it's just a light. You know, we use our, like you said, Nick, our kind of cultural vernacular and our folklore to paint a skin and use that different language, where really they all might be the same anomaly, just showing up in different ways. And I think it's been a slow progression towards people, instead of thinking that all these things are in separate silos, that they're, again, not saying that the Loch Ness Monster is also an alien, but these things are probably more connected than not connected.
An alien with a lakeside vacation home, that's
right?
all.
Yeah.
400-year-old timeshare.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's been a slow natural progression. I think the big hurdle we have from a cultural standpoint is, you know, what Brian brought up here in the beginning is the use of the strict use of either hard science to answer these questions or just like spirituality to answer these questions. I think once we start breaking down those barriers more and more, we're going to see more truth slowly come to light. That's my opinion. So, Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, the interdimensionality, I guess that's how you pronounce it, is a really interesting word, because what I'm seeing is a trend towards seeing everything must be coming from a different dimension. It doesn't matter what it could be. It could be, you know, there's just all kinds of cryptids and mythological creatures that you will now see documentaries on. Some of them you've never heard of. I mean, the typical ones, the abominable snowman or just the California Bigfoot, is no more. There's just such a wide range of them. And I know Nick and I have talked in the past about Mothman. And I think in my last podcast with this group, Nick had posited a theory that somehow the TNT plant where I lived near had something to do with this. You know, could there be a connection? I don't really know. I think the main thing is there seems to be a trend around things that we don't physically understand how they work. So, you know, like any good science, you bunch it up into a big theory until you can take it apart and figure out how all the pieces work together. You know, and I think I'm seeing so much of a crossover between the Jersey Devil and it must be something satanic, or could be something demonic or whatever, or no, it must be some kind of a hybrid science experiment that went wrong, or no, it's something that is a alien creature that has been infesting this area for centuries. And I think there is a crossover now between alien phenomena. There's a big rage around it right now, and all these other beings that we don't understand. We're just trying to, we say they come from a different dimension because we don't know where they come from. We don't really know how they physically manifest. I have even seen documentaries where there's a crossover between gray aliens and ghostly demonic phenomena, which I find just very odd combination. But I think we're all grouping it into one theory and trying to make sense of it.
Very well said.
When
Cool.
we talk about dimensions, I'm oftentimes reminded of this 19th century novel written by a mathematician. I believe it was called Flatland, Brendan. Basically, it talks about the life of a or a three-dimensional being that then travels to a two-dimensional world, and he's treated almost as this messianic figure because he's talking about this whole other level of reality that they can't comprehend. And he goes to a one-dimensional world at one point as well. I think about, I read a lot and I've seen a lot of lectures on superstring theory. I have a very basic idea of, how up to, I think, 11 dimensions would work. It's important to remember that we inhabit all the dimensions at once, even though we only are able to experience a limited number of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I'm always in the role of a doubting Thomas, I suppose all of these magisteria could potentially be the result of other dimensions, other timelines. And for whatever reason, they're able maybe to travel through, and much like that Flatland novel.
Yeah, I think that what you're kind of getting at is that we have these different visualization aids to help us try and understand what dimensions like may or may not be. I mean, I can only assume that they're they are very, like, our ancillary understanding is very far from probably what the reality of it actually is. I think because you do have anomalies that have all these different elements to them, that the whole idea of interdimensionality, I think that's the right word, like you said, interdimensionality, is a very tantalizing mechanism to maybe try and answer some of these questions. Because like Brian was saying, we have all these data points that we've been gathering in all these different ways, and some of them have been gathered in very, very stringent scientific ways that would hold up to scrutiny under any normal look. And I think that when you talk about things being interdimensional, part of me gets why people want to go there, because it may answer some of our questions. But again, because we know so little about it, I still think it falls into our favorite fallacy of, answering one unknown with another relative unknown.
Well, there's a whole argument in the theological arena. There's the God of the gaps theory, and I feel as though, as things are being increasingly explained, as people are using scientific measurements and whatnot to try to get deeper into this, it being another dimension and being able to travel through other dimensions is a whole untapped realm where they can place that, and it makes it more difficult to prove or disprove. In that way, it's I kind of see it as maybe potentially falling into that as well.
Oh, absolutely. The problem is whenever you move from conjecture to turning a conjecture into a premises for something else, when really, like we've been saying, all this stuff is unknown. The mechanisms may look like some of the things that we see in other realms of hard science or spirituality, but they're colored by so many things,
All I know for sure is that Chewbacca is an alien. He's a Wookiee.
Yeah,
he
no,
looks an awful lot like Bigfoot.
Well, he's from Kashyyyk. So if we want to, that's an excellent point.
Listen to you, nerd.
Well, but yeah, if you want to argue that that all Bigfoot are just displaced Wookiees from Kashyyyk after the Empire finally went in and wiped them all out,
it was many years ago.
It was. All I'm saying is I'm willing to enter that conversation. No, but yeah, I think it's interesting but like you said, Nick, we exist in these different, how I like to think of the paranormal in relation to different dimensions. And you guys, I'd like to see what you guys think about this. I like to think of it kind of like we were talking about infrared earlier. It's just the upper end of like the spectrum that we can see. It's there whenever we use, like if we put on infrared, goggles, we can see the infrared spectrum. Maybe with all these different dimensions and all these different paranormal happenings, maybe those things are existing in other realities, but it's not only visual, but it's physical.
It's like they have to be split by a prism. Like they have to be refracted in order,
like it's almost
which would explain why different places or different elemental things would have to be or are so often present. We've talked about the presence of quartz a lot, and
all
the
those
presence
kind
of water people talk about.
And there are certain areas where the to use like a photo layer editing term, the opacity is turned up in some areas more than others, so you can see and you can interact with that layer of reality a little bit more. Sometimes it just happens in blips because of, you know, who knows, energy spikes or whatever. But that's how I like to kind of visualize the idea of other dimensions existing along with ours that maybe these things come from, you know, or can interact with us sometimes with.
Brian, any thoughts on that?
Well, it's one of my newer pursuits lately has been Alaskan aliens. And I don't know if you've heard about any of those types of phenomena, but there is the newest trend now is to say that there's a significant alien presence within the Alaskan Triangle, which is kind of like a triangle that covers the state of Alaska. And so much that they talk about is based upon the invisibleness of these crafts and where they are staying and where are they, and how do they show up in one place versus go to another. And one of the things that they've been talking about is these interdimensional, I don't know what the terminology would be, but they're like a portal, using a Minecraft term, where these, and they were really positing that the energies in these, not just craft or beings or whatever, but any other kind of phenomena can just indiscriminately go in between these portals. And, you know, there's been a lot of other talk about certain kind of ley lines and different geomagnetic significance, like Stonehenge and some of those places where there is significant energy, or they feel that there's ley lines that demonstrate some kind of ability to travel from one place to another. And that's kind of like a little bit what I think Brendan was alluding to, was all these dimensions, and I think you were too, Nick, all these dimensions are out there. We're kind of living them, but we can't really travel between them. But there's other entities that can physically change the properties of their being or go through portals. And a lot of the ghost hunting information too posits around portals and how certain kinds of ghost entities can travel between one point to another in very odd ways that we can't physically understand.
Most of the things which we do understand is based on inherently limitations. Art is based on limitations. What we think of when we travel is based on a series of limitations, if you really want to get down to it. Because I think about, you know, that fifth dimension where if you could travel within the fifth dimension, you could, as again, my basic layman's understanding is, go from any point in an infinite series of possible outcomes and possible points in history, meaning that just as we were to look at my life as the example that's often used as a snake, it spans from the time I was born until the time I'm deceased, and, you know, slightly before and slightly thereafter. But in that fifth dimension, my understanding is that if I were to be able to travel through that, not only could I travel at any point in my lifeline, but also from all of the potential branches that are brought on by an infinite number of factors, be it the decisions I make, be it the decisions that are made that I feel the consequences of, and be it even just to appreciate the idea of infinity is to understand or to wrap one's head around that there is a world an entire other timeline where my walls are red and not blue, and that would be the only difference. To be able to travel through that. So for me to wrap my head around the idea that there is a way that in some other time, in some other place, some cognizant being has unlocked an ability to travel within that dimension is an amazing but almost impossible thing for me to wrap my head around, because it would essentially it has to remain tethered to a specific time and specific place in that specific branch. And it can go, but I imagine it'd be like spinning an infinitely large wheel of chance and then being confident that you could go back to from whence you had come. People talk about time travel in the past, and it had always been about how the minor effect that you would make in that timeline would ultimately affect what you would go back to. And I think my understanding is that wouldn't be the case. It would just be another branch.
Boy. One, yes. If you want to go... yeah, so like I agree that like if the interdimensional thing is the answer, it sure does answer a lot of questions. Like Brian was kind of saying, you have these ideas of portals, like quote unquote portals, that come up all over the place in all kinds of different folklore. And I mean, like when I think portals, I think Fae. That's my first thought. These are things that everyone has been talking about for time immemorial. These aren't even new ideas. We just have new incidences to study and to look at, to talk about. Kind of what you were saying, Nick, with the whole different timelines and everything. I think that shows two things. This is me kind of playing devil's advocate to what we're talking about. One, look how many hoops you had to jump through with the standard model to make this stuff make sense. Part of me thinks that's because we can't get our minds out of using the standard model of physics that we have. Everything has to be explainable in that paradigm.
Real quick, when you say standard model, are you talking about...
I'm talking about like physics as we generally understand, like quantum physics.
It has to be based on empirical...
Yeah, empirical evidence.
Because I would say that the superstring theory has been the dominant theory because it's a unifying theory between, it's been said that the more one understands about macro physics, the less one can understand about quantum. And that this is the unifying theory. And some people are kind of starting to go against it because of the fact that it has been such a dominant theory in physics. But beyond that, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's basically what I'm saying, is that like I think that like part of this conversation, though it is fun to kind of go in circles, is almost destined to go in circles, kind of like an Ouroboros, like you were talking about with the snake. Just as we cannot comprehend the supposed reality of other dimensions, we also cannot comprehend the next paradigm shift in thinking that is inevitably gonna come. And what I mean by that is, before we had germ theory and before we had any of those things, we did have people that thought that, in Greek philosophy, you have atomists, they thought that there was a singular thing that made up everything. So you kind of wrap their head around it. But what that actually meant and how it played out and how much deeper you could actually go weren't things they could ever think about,
because it wasn't things that they could...
It's
kind of what you said, is we can't see what we can't view.
Correct.
And we can't know what hasn't yet been thought.
Exactly. And that's something that, like, from a scientific standpoint, I think we get caught up in a lot, is that like 300 years from now, whatever we think about physics, we're going to be like, man, those people were dumb, because that's what we thought. That's what people thought 500 years ago. Now,
having read about germ theory and that just the idea of washing your hands in a hospital setting is upsettingly recent development. Reading about the history of the John Hopkins.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And now, granted, I don't want this to be interpreted by anybody that's saying I'm like anti-scientific paradigm or anything. Because again, I think that in literally every measure of the word, we need to give science all the funding and all the attention. But when it comes to dealing with some of these ideas like this, whenever we're talking theoretically and we're talking hypothetically, I think it's important to recognize some of those constraints philosophically and linguistically that we might have.
Yeah, I'll say it again. I want to phrase it a little differently. We can't view, we can't. Yeah, never mind. I think I said it fine. We can't see what we can't view. We can't know what hasn't yet been thought.
Yeah, because whenever you talk about
spitball.
Yeah, and again, like eventually, I'm going to do a whole episode on the shifting of scientific paradigms and scientific revolutions, but like philosophically, that's something that it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around because we can't predict it. We can theorize about what'll happen next, but any big enough disruptive event that happens is going to be such a game changer that we can't,
if we could find a way of refracting time.
Yeah, exactly.
We would look at a lot of the things that have
who knows what it's going to be. Yeah.
Right. The common the common folklore, maybe if we can refract time and find that way of doing it, then we could see the things that we can't yet view.
Yeah.
And then maybe that would explain things.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Maybe someday we will figure out how to look into different dimensions, just like we look into different light spectrums like infrared, and suddenly we can put on goggles and see that there's brownies running around our house, and there's a Bigfoot up in the garden right now, and there's an alien. Well, I mean, brownies is in like little hobgoblins, but and that there's like a Bigfoot out in the garden right now, and there's 2 UFOs above the house, and we're just like, crap, were those always there? And like, meanwhile, they're up there like, yeah, bro, we've always been here, So, but we just literally
fantasize.
Yeah, that's what I like to imagine is going to happen.
I've often fantasized that one of the things I would really love is just special glasses. This is the nerdiest thing I'm going to say. I go and I drive through places, and Brian, you and I, Brendan, you and I too have talked about this a bit. And I say, could you imagine being there when this grand building was opened? Can you imagine what it looked like? I walked through cemeteries as a child because I loved the history, and I would always get excited when I would see different languages on there. But I would stand on that ground and I would think, when this person went in the ground, there was a very sad gathering right on the spot where I'm standing. 100 years before I was even born, I always kind of wanted a world that could exist and where I could have glasses that I would put them on and I could see through those layers and see through the film of years, and to put them on and experience the world that had been, to live those memories, not to interact, no interaction, but like the ghost of Christmas future, almost like visiting. And that has always amazed me. So everywhere I go and everything I see, I try to do that. I try to imagine it in its newest thing. So I'm very excited for these future scientific developments that you are championing there, Brendan, because maybe one day I'll get my spectacular spectacles.
You might, you never know.
But I think we should wrap up, Brian. I'm kind of curious as kind of any closing thoughts on your end, but I'm happy that you came in as being the person we interviewed about a cryptid thing, and then we got really deep in the weeds about cryptid possibilities.
Yeah, certainly I wasn't sure what to expect tonight, so I do appreciate you asking me to join. I think I just want to make kind of more of a holistic comment on what Brendan was talking about the emphasis around really, we don't know what we don't know, and there needs to be more research, and there's going to be a paradigm shift. I don't know if we should just be looking that direction. I think there is plenty of Native American and other cultural traditions, folklore, those types of things that actually might be, I know it's kind of a soft science and it's very, maybe more holistic and subjective, but we need to be integrating more subjective with objective approaches to looking at these problems. My own field, which is psychology, went through that dilemma it's probably about 120 some years ago, or more, 130 some years ago. I know Nick and I used to talk about phrenology a lot, and he was wanting my opinion on that. But, and I don't think there was anything to that. But I think that, I had a physics major in college. He once said to me, Brian, you're a psychology major. That's a fake science. And I said, well, Terry, I'm not too sure about that. I really think there has to be a mix between the subjective, the psychology, the folklore, the traditions, probably looking at some of the cognitive, the precognition, the spirituality of things. You have people who are seers. They have the ability to see things that we can't see. There's a ton of people out there who can see some very bizarre things and predict things that we don't know where they're coming from. Those are very subjective. I think we have to be very careful not to get too caught up in the science entirely, and maybe focus on the fake sciences or the things that don't seem scientific, but are probably very informative and can inform the direction that the science goes.
I could not agree more. That was very, very well said, Brian.
And Brendan, as an audio engineer, you've been accused by some of our engineer friends of not being a real engineer. So
I've been accused by the PA Department of Engineering by not being a real engineer.
All right. Well, it has been lovely speaking with both of you this evening. And as always, if you would like to weigh in, if you would like to chastise my insufficient understanding of quantum physics, that's welcome as well. Just don't be a total jerk about it.
And if anyone has any stories or has any ideas or thoughts, you can reach us either on Facebook or Instagram at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or email us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.